Hi, my name is Spencer, and I'm a video editor living in England. As you might tell from my voice, I'm not originally from there. I grew up in California, and I miss my family very much. So much, in fact, that I regularly stay up pretty late on Friday nights so I can see them through video calls. And to keep myself occupied while waiting for the calls to begin, I decided to start live streaming some acoustic virtual concerts a little while back. Music, however, is something that I'm relatively unskilled at, so I decided to put my technological skills to use and at the very least make my live streams a little nicer in one way or another. I've been treating it as practice, so I can get better at two skills at once and make a portfolio piece to annoy my friends with. So here's the mission statement. Improve my music live streams and bolster my portfolio by coming up with an aesthetic and building motion graphics to support it. Let's go. One of my favorite parts of December is the Jingle Jam, an annual charity livestream held by a gaming entertainment company called the Yogscast. I watched their content all the time growing up, and I even had the privilege of working as an editor for a Yogscast partner channel earlier this year. So I figured a fun way to pay homage to my forefathers would be to figure out how they designed the Jingle Jam and try it out for my own livestream. An actual Jingle Jam, since there would be music involved. Now, obviously I wasn't going to call it that since it would be gauche to take the name from a charity live stream, and while I doubted my 9 YouTube fans would end up redirecting enough traffic from the actual event, I wanted to be courteous. I decided to call it E-Wassailing, in reference to the traditional carol Here We Come A-Wassailing, and because I think the practice of using E as a prefix is a fun little blend of antiquated and charming, kinda like macrame. After deciding on the E name, I got started. The first thing I did was write a letter to my neighbors, apologizing for the noise and letting them know that I planned to do a music live stream on Friday night. I wanted to negotiate the time with them so that I wouldn't end up bothering them any more than I had to. Next, I got to work designing the layout. The first thing I wanted to do was the logo. I had a few ideas, some predicated around the traditional wassailing bowl or goblet, but I was never happy with how they looked. I decided to design some fake charity logos as a warm-up, since the Yogscast live streams always had logos off to the side to remind people what they're raising money for. I roughed them out and then came up with some other ideas for my own logo, so I made a few attempts at that as well. Then, I began roughing out the layout using references from the Jingle Jams of the past few years. The Jingle Jam has a very consistent aesthetic, which made it easy for me to identify the rationale behind the design choices. For example, in previous years, donor messages would scroll through the bottom, but it had since been reserved for information about how to donate, probably to make sure that that information was consistently on screen. As of this year, the amount of overlay dedicated to non-gaming had diminished significantly, and the amount of snowing effects had been reduced, most likely due to bitrate concerns, if I had to guess. There are plenty of mainstays between years, some which I chose to copy for my rip-off homage, and some which I chose to alter. For example, I figured it'd be wise to place the donation amount next to the donation percentage and beneath the goal, instead of near the bottom corner. The reason for this is that the information is closer together and easier to compare, and also because placing things at the bottom of a video overlay usually results in the player window interfering with visibility. By the time I had finished designing the layout, I had heard back from my neighbors. They even sent me a nice little card, cementing themselves as the nicest people I've met since moving away from Bournemouth. With the times now arranged, I opened up the After Effects file to an advertisement graphic for my stream I had made and tweaked several times throughout the last few weeks. I added in a Santa hat I had drawn earlier, fussed with the colors, and added in a snowfall effect. I knew that snowfall tended to mess with bitrate, so I made sure that it didn't cover anything I deemed important, like the title and information about when it'd go live. Then I exported it. I opened up Adobe Illustrator to begin making better, cleaner versions of my rough logos. However, while working on them, I came up with some other ideas, so I decided to open up Blender and rough them out with a model I had lying around. Then, I exported a screenshot and rendered it in Illustrator. I continued to bounce around various programs, vectorizing and cleaning up my roughs in Illustrators and finishing them up with Glimps, occasionally dipping back into Blender for one reason or another until I had a decent assortment of fake logos at my disposal. The next thing I wanted to do was make a background. The Yogscast use a fairly simple and effective one, a tiling pattern evocative of a Christmassy aesthetic, combined with pixel art as a visual shorthand for, gamers. But I wanted to experiment more with my resources rather than just copy them wholesale. I set up a quick Blender scene with a repeating motion background of a bunch of snowflakes. Unfortunately, the method I used completely fell apart in the export, so I knew I needed to redo it. I hadn't decided how I was going to fix it, so I moved on and started designing a layout in Photoshop with what assets I did have. I used Photoshop because it had the best tools for making rounded rectangles, which I felt would look pretty good in this context. I was wrong. Overall, the design looked more than a little sloppy. The gradients were too heavy in some areas and not heavy enough in others. The text on the 3D logo was illegible, and the whole thing just looked a little dated. So, like the snowflakes, I decided to work on something else while I thought about how I could fix it. I refined a few of the fake charity logos and tried them out in After Effects with a few gradient tools. I liked the look of them, so I set up a 20-second loop with some corner pins and gradients for each logo. This was basically the same approach that the Yogscast used in their streams, and I understand why. It fits nicely with the aesthetic, and it's a clean yet quirky way to present the information. I set the rectangles and the logos to be affected by the corner pin, but then I remembered that in the real world, companies and organizations often have strict rules about the usage of their symbols and logos, so I decided to separate them and make sure that there was no perspective warping on the logos themselves, just the boxes. The next thing I wanted to work on was the background for the Afk screen. I'd watched a few videos by the Yogscast's motion designer, Joe Hickson, before, so I had a pretty good idea about how he worked. To emulate his work style, I decided to lay off of Blender for a little while and go harder on After Effects. I fiddled around with noise textures and displacement for a little while until I found a way to recreate the rather fetching version of their motion background they used last year. Then I moved on. I went back into Blender and began to model a snowflake. I set up a quick thing to reflect a plane 6 times at 60 degrees each, since snowflakes are symmetrical around 6 axes. I began messing around, trying my best to avoid accidentally creating a hate symbol, and liked what I came up with. I did a few more, eventually opting to reflect them along an additional axis because it looked nicer. I began setting up the movement and linked their geometry to a noise texture so I could procedurally alter their pattern. After it rendered, I opened up Photoshop to begin preparing additional resources I knew I'd want for later. Then I opened Blender back up to begin working on the quote-unquote donation counter that I was going to place off to the side. I hit the ocean button, colored it gold, and started dropping Zs all over the screen. I should explain here. I didn't want to take donations for myself or anything because I don't feel comfortable asking people for money. So I decided to make a donation box dedicated to rest, with the plan that each person visiting my stream could comment a certain phrase, and I would give myself one more day of a break after finishing with this project. I figured it was deserved because I had spent basically the entirety of last month working on various overlays or behind-the-scenes videos about how I made those overlays, and while it was creatively rewarding, it was also exceedingly tiring. Anyways, I made a few incrementally shrinking alpha mats to account for the percentages of donations, and kept going. Once that was finished, I decided it was time to start compiling my things. I made another few rectangles in Photoshop and Glimpse and began fiddling with things in After Effects. I started setting up the layouts to my satisfaction, playing with the blending modes and spacing, and seeing what I liked. I even used the technique I figured out earlier on the motion graphic to make a little watery-looking surface for the quote-unquote donation box. When I had some general ideas of what worked, I began to export them and set them up in OBS, going back to tweak things whenever necessary. The last thing I wanted to do for the day was donation messages. Whenever you donate in the Jingle Jam, you can choose to write a little message which will pop up on the stream in a short period of time. I figured it'd be fun and a little more amusing for my audience if, instead of the general support and positivity that the Yogscast shoutouts usually deliver, they were a little snarkier, kind of like my audience exclusively donated for the purpose of cyberbullying me. So I took some time to write up a few 100-word messages, and then I set up a template in After Effects and began copy-pasting them in. After doing around 155, I set them to render out overnight, posted my advertisement to social media, and called it for the day. The next day, I had a blissfully short list of things to do since I had gotten so much done on Thursday. I realized that if I just had the Jingle Jam layout atop a video of me playing guitar, it'd be a little dull, so I decided early on that I wanted people to be sitting atop the stream to act as quote-unquote commentators, even if they didn't say anything or comment at all. So I reached out to some friends to get videos for it. I realized after talking to the first one that I would have difficulty articulating what it was exactly that I needed, so I filmed an example and made a tutorial explaining the project in further detail, how I do it, and what I would need from them. Alright, hi, it's me Spencer from Friendship and I guess school. I just wanted to provide a quick tutorial / guidance for the thing that I'm looking for when I ask you guys about, send you the weird messages out of nowhere. Sorry about that. So basically what I want to accomplish with this next project is go for a more like conventional streaming kind of thing. And my idea for that was to have people in front of the live stream that looked like they were like green screened on, like in those Twitch streams where they're playing video games and so on. So what I want to do is I want to record a quick video that loops, just like this video that you are currently watching now. By the time that the thing has gotten to this far, I think the video is looped like 5 or 6 times. If you noticed it, good for you. You have a sharp eye, and if not, then don't worry about it because it was very subtle. I'm using a technique here called a morph cut, or if you're using Avid like a loser, it's called a fluid morph. So I have frame 1 and I have frame 2, and the computer figures out what goes in between there, and it tries to make a seamless transition between these two things. I use it a lot for when I do documentaries or when I need to hide something subtle in a film. When you look at this video that you're seeing in front of you right now, there are a lot of things that I would want out of a video that is looping. For example, the colors that I'm wearing have a stark contrast against the wall. The wall isn't entirely empty, but it's empty enough in the area around me that I can chroma key or rotoscope you out later. There can be movements in between, but there needs to be like enough consistency between one point and another that I can hide a fluid morph in between there and make it look like the video goes. And it would be nice, like I know it's really uncomfortable to be like sitting there staring at a spot on your wall for 2 minutes, but like the longer clip that I can get, the less weird it's gonna look that there's this like looping thing where like a person laughs every 30 seconds or something like that. Eventually, I received all of the videos from my friends. I combed through them frame by frame to find a few frames I could seamlessly cut together, and then exported them. My initial plan was to use the rotobrush tool to mask around them since none of my friends had a green screen. However, the rotobrush tool had other plans that day, so I had to work around it. In the real streams, the Yogscast have a green well-lit wall that they can key out, so I pulled a quick and lazy key and dropped a green background layer on the clips to see if I could use it to get a better green screen-esque look. When you use a green screen, you'll pretty often have these areas or certain pieces of the picture that will just look a bit odd, like they'll be semi-transparent or the fringes of the hair will look off. This can be for a litany of reasons. If the green screen isn't that good, if the program can't detect it, if the lighting is off, if someone is standing too close to the green screen and they're casting a shadow, if the green light is reflecting off of a slightly shiny surface on their clothing, you get the idea. If I had stuck with the rotobrush, you would have had relatively clean outlines, which would have looked fine on the stream, but they wouldn't be very authentic. So I wanted to recreate that green screen wonkiness as best I could by adding in an actual picture of a green screen behind them and then keying it out in OBS. My plan worked okay, so I moved on and only did 2 more because I was worried about how long it was taking to render these out. Sorry, Jay. By no means was I happy with the results, but I knew I needed to keep moving if I wanted to get everything done before the stream started. The next thing I wanted to do was add on to the motion graphic, as I worried it was a little bare bones. So I opened up Blender and modeled a quick abstract shape. Then I imported a function I learned a little while ago while I was designing a fake GeoCities site, one that turns a render into pixel art using some basic mathematics. I rendered out my now pixely abstract shape and then imported my procedurally changing snowflakes I had made earlier. I set them up in front of my camera, which I ensured was orthographic, and then rendered out a few choice frames where I thought the snowflakes looked nice. Then, since I was still in Blender, I made a quick composition where I could make some golden letters fly out with the words 2 weeks written so that I could appropriately celebrate my milestone should I hit it. After that, I made another new composition so I could set up a quick scene, because I assumed it would be a little dull if it was just me playing guitar surrounded by gamer stream stuff. I modeled some presents, made a tree, and found some tiling wrapping paper designs on the internet that I could use as a texture. Then I made a sphere with some smooth shading and a nice shiny surface, and I set it to emit from the tree as a particle system, so it looked a little bit like a Christmas bauble. Then, for good measure, I rotated the camera a little and set up another scene just so that I could have some variety when I switched between scenes in OBS. Now that all of that was done, I opened up After Effects and began to place my things in. I added the abstract pixel art onto some of the overlays and played with some effects to make it look a little more pixely. I did some other touch-ups and then started taking my pixel snowflake renders from earlier and exporting the ones I liked as individual images. From there, I made another composition and made them float around a bit, so that I could have some nice snow up in the corner of my stream, just like in this year's Jingle Jam. Now I had done most of everything I needed to do before the stream, and with a few hours to spare. I decided to go back to my earlier rotoscoping for my commentators and update it a little to fix some things that had been bothering me, like missing teeth and issues with hair. With that done, I set everything back into OBS and started thinking some more about the layout. I went back into After Effects one more time to update the motion graphics and then had some dinner. The last thing I wanted to do was the color grading. This is supposedly uncommon with live streaming setups, and when I suggested it to a YouTuber I worked with, he even balked at the idea, but I think that adding a lookup table to cameras and graphics is a really nice way to wring out any extra aesthetic sense that might be hiding in there, and tying all of the individual pieces together. I got some screenshots from OBS and began grading a bit. I was tempted to do some creative coloring here and make my camera look like green in the shadows and red in the highlights, but I decided not to. I also wanted to standardize the videos of my friends, but unfortunately all of their setups were too different for that to be feasible, so I gave up and just tried to make them look nice instead of uniform. Suddenly, I realized that something was wrong. No matter how much my overlay looked like the Yogscast overlays, the stream wouldn't have the right feeling unless I managed to capture the same energy as the Yogscast. Now, as much as I enjoy the officially licensed Family Feud video game from 2012 or the occasional game of Tetris, it had been a really long time since I'd gotten into video games like I used to. But I only had a short while before the stream started, so I acted fast. I went out to the local corner shop and bought myself a packet of Dorito-branded crisps, as well as a beverage called Mountain Dew. I began using gamer terminology in my everyday life. Gentlemen, I have to say, you guys pwned me, epic style. I started wearing gamer clothing. I downloaded a first-person shooter, and I even ordered an authentic gamer chair from Sweden, the same country that developed Minecraft, to replace the chair I had been using previously. But I knew that wasn't enough. Sure, I was walking the walk and talking the talk and doing the do, but I still didn't feel like a true gamer. So I decided to dye my hair a darker, edgier color to complete my transition into a cool and hip gamer. Now I was the real deal. But I needed to know for sure, so I decided to take my gamer cred out for a spin. Hey everybody, and welcome back to my Minecraft Let's Play. If you recall the last episode, that settled it. I did some final tweaking in OBS, decided to turn off the Christmas tree parts of the overlay since it was a little too much, and got ready to stream. I am a dwarf and I'm digging a hole. Diggy hole, diggy diggy hole. I am a dwarf and I'm digging a hole. Diggy hole, digging a hole. And hey, it was a really nice final stream. A handful of friends hung out in the live chat, we talked for a bit, and I got to share some lovely tunes with creepy Christian overtones, which is, at the end of the day, what Christmas is all about. And thanks to the spare overlays I made but ended up not using, I could successfully avoid having to explain my entire thing during my family video call later that night. Before I close, some final thoughts. One of the things about this last project that I'm quite happy with is the fact that even though my mission was to copy something, I still tried new things and messed up a little bit along the way. If I had just mindlessly aped the aesthetic of the Yogscast, I might have gotten to where I ended up sooner, but I wouldn't have learned the rationale behind the decisions made to get to that point. One of the reasons why I wanted to copy the Jingle Jam as a case study was because it is iterated upon every year, so in doing this project I noticed which parts changed and which parts didn't change. I think seeing the differences throughout time really helped me learn more about the art of designing for live streams. My biggest criticism of this overlay is the fact that it's pretty busy. Everything on this has its own little thing going on, which gets to be a bit much, and I feel it runs the risk of distracting a potential viewer or drawing their eyes away from the important part of the screen. While I still think the assets on their own are pretty to look at, combining them all together creates this miasma, this big mess which might be visually intimidating for new viewers. I should have tested things sooner before committing to making so many moving parts. They say a design is complete not when you cannot think of anything to add, but when you cannot think of anything to take away, and I shouldn't have shied away from letting certain assets speak for themselves or potentially creating a better visual contrast by animating certain parts and leaving other parts untouched. I don't think it absolutely kills the design, and some clients might be impressed with the amount of detail work that went into everything here, but if I were designing this for a real charity, I'd probably go back and remove anything that I feel doesn't contribute meaningfully. While this might be a good portfolio piece to show off what I can do in around 2 days, it's just a little too flashy for regular use in my opinion. When I started this project, this whole challenge where I was going to make and document a totally new and unique video overlay every week for 5 weeks, I had some very basic ideas about what designing for live streams involved. Those ideas developed throughout as I made more and more overlays and learned about the limitations of the field, and I'm very proud of what I've accomplished and pushed myself to make, even the ones that are a little weaker than the others. However, this overlay probably ended up teaching me the most since the first one, because it's the first instance of me not just designing for myself, even if I'm actually still just designing for myself. Copying an overlay used in a charity event and playing within the confines of this isn't personal art, this is for a professional setting, has helped me learn a lot more about the application of these skills I've developed and how I might be able to use them moving forwards. After, of course, my 2-week break. Bye now. Thank you guys so much for being here for all of this and joining me for these last 5 or 6 weeks have been absolutely ridiculous, and I had a lot of fun and it was tiring, but I'm really glad that I did it. Big shout out to everybody who was willing to be a part of this one, and everybody who was sitting in the chat for this one and so on, and of course to Eliza and Patrick and Natashka for physically being in this stream as the commentators and so on, and of course to the Yogscast for inspiring this shit, because this is a lot of fun, and now it's over, so I guess I can finally go to sleep.